Following President Obama's news conference, I spoke with CBSN contributor Leslie Sanchez, national political correspondent for the Hill Reid Wilson, and Real Clear Politics reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns.
It's hard to say that specifically. The most important line came in that part of the conversation where he said he wanted to protect the integrity of the electoral process. And if we think a lot about the heated rhetoric that was happening leading into the election about rigged elections, there were a lot of questions about that. That put the whole process into jeopardy, and then you compound that with this Russian hacking issue. The interesting part about that is he specifically talked about WikiLeaks, where basically the milk has been spilled. You know, there's nothing you can do about it. The information was out there. You can't roll that back. And he didn't really put a lot of criticism on the DNC for basically what was exposed in those leaks. So to be fair, you could see the presidential aspect of that of trying to stabilize the electoral process, number one priority. I do continue to believe that the incoming administration will take that mantle, but the political posturing, both with the void in the DNC conversation and also kind of putting some of that pressure on people for believing it, that's just playing politics.
Yeah, and Caitlin, we were talking about how this is not anything really new that we're hearing from Barack Obama. He talked about that vulnerability, though, that ability to be hacked, so related to the political divide that exists here in our country.
And it was interesting because he was kind of almost raising the question of, you know, why wasn't this more of an important issue to voters on the campaign trail? We saw the issue and threats of actual physical terrorist attack really resonated with people over the course of the campaign in terms of polls. But the cybersecurity element was not really a huge element. Yes, it was brought up during primary and president and general election debates, but Trump throughout really dismissed the idea that it was the Russians, even against the new information that the Obama administration said in July. So it's really interesting to kind of the way that he was framing that. But I think Leslie brings up a really critical point, which is that this is not the actual tampering with the election voting machines, for example.
Right.
And Donald Trump has been trying to make the argument that this is all about trying to delegitimize his presidency, and you do at the same time have Republicans saying we can do both at the same time. Yes, you won fair and square, but yes, we have to look into this investigation into the hacking.
And Reid, the president was very clear, sort of looking at the Democratic Party and saying the Democratic Party has to look at itself and look at that grassroots level. You know, just thinking right now what's going on in North Carolina, where you have the current administration trying to change the control that the incoming administration will have. Does the Democratic Party have that ability right now to go ahead and take that closer look at the grassroots level and make a difference?
Well, those are two totally different questions. In the first half, Barack Obama talked about spending time campaigning in southern Illinois among farmers, among people who probably weren't going to vote for him in the end, but at least he showed up and at least he tried. That was an implicit, barely implicit rebuke of the Clinton campaign, which really focused its turnout efforts on the Obama coalition and what we call the rising American electorate, minorities, young people, people who live in urban cores rather than in suburban areas, rather than in more rural areas. Let's not forget that President Obama got elected with a significant portion of the white working class vote. Those voters are the people who don't feel like they heard from the Clinton campaign, heard some kind of economic message from the Clinton campaign. As to what's happening in North Carolina, that's a Republican-led legislature passing legislation to be signed by an outgoing Republican governor. The Democrats are in the minority there. There wasn't much they could do. The governor's already signed one of those pieces of legislation, and I haven't looked at my phone in the last 5 minutes or so, but he might have signed the other one in the meantime while we're sitting here.
It just seems to speak more again to that political divide that still exists and doesn't seem to be going away, at least at this point, despite the urging of the president to sort of maybe bring that into light with some of the vulnerabilities that are out there. President Obama did cite a poll about how Trump voters view Russian President Vladimir Putin right now. Here's some of the sound, and again, we'll get reaction out of it.
Now, this is just one poll, but a pretty credible source. 37% of Republican voters approve of Putin. Over a third of Republican voters approve of Vladimir Putin, the former head of the KGB. Ronald Reagan would roll over in his grave.
And Leslie, we heard this even during the election being brought up. Can you map out right now what's going on with the Republican Party and where some of the division is?
I can't map out President Obama trying to speak for Ronald Reagan. I was still scratching my head on that one. And so are many Republicans.
But Leslie, would you agree that Leslie, would you agree though that Ronald Reagan would be rolling over in his grave at the approval of Putin right now by Republicans?
The bigger issue, and I don't think that's a very fair characterization. What does approval mean? He started out by saying that the relationship with Putin and with Russia has eroded, deteriorated. It is not where it needs to be. Republicans, just like all Americans, recognize that. So and putting a value on that, on approval, I don't know what that means. You know, I think we have to be a little bit careful there. But the bigger point on this issue of Russia, and then when he did talk about his policies related to Syria, where he used the term, I cannot claim we have been successful. I think Republicans are going to come back and say this is what we're talking about, that many of the foreign policy and national security positions have failed under this president. And that's why it's moving in a different direction and trying to find ways to mend, enhance, and strengthen relationships economically, politically, and from a national security perspective.
President Obama certainly talking about Syria, talked about, you know, what his personal feelings, the moral responsibility and how that's weighed on him during this, and then got into safe zones when asked about that also. Leslie, the Trump administration, at least Donald Trump right now, tweeting about considering those possibilities, how much will he weigh what President Barack Obama is saying to him now in regards to what that will take and what he would like to do?
You know, I can't speak to that, but you raise a really interesting thing. There is the forward-facing President-elect Trump, and then there's this other behind the scenes, the negotiator. What we do know to be true is that in the same way that the olive branch has been extended by President Obama to help and provide support and give guidance to the incoming transition and administration, I think there will be a lot of back-channel conversations about the role and strengthening and lessons learned looking ahead. But forward-facing from social media and political posturing, that's a different story. And it's probably going to be a little bit of both as he's trying to align an agenda and show how different it is from the Democratic administration.
We talked going into this how it is President Barack Obama's final press conference of 2016, could be his last press conference that we see. He talked about being stronger and more prosperous than 8 years ago. And I want a reaction from all of you on maybe your biggest takeaway here, but it also had this strange moment where we did have a reporter who it appeared had passed out, and there was a lot of commotion in the briefing room, and it seemed in some ways appropriate for the crazy year that it has been surrounding politics here in the nation. Caitlin, I'll start with you. I guess what is the takeaway, your biggest takeaway from this? And some of that is in Barack Obama sort of talking about the legacy that he leaves behind.
Well, interestingly, you played the clip earlier of Obama doing his, then President-elect Obama doing a press conference in 2008, shortly after winning. And that was very focused on the economy because that was the biggest issue at hand. And he felt like he had to address with that. He had already started to work with Congress to address some of that. Now he wants to claim economic victories and pointing to things that he sees, at least on paper, that show signs of economic process. And of course, the Federal Reserve just raised interest rates. He's also trying to set it up so that the next president doesn't come in and kind of take credit for what he thinks are successes in the economy. So that was a really interesting. It's interesting to consider when presidents come in, the issues that they're dealing with at the time. But it is really remarkable to see the contrasts in presidents-elect, right? Obama did the press conferences, and mostly every time he announced a cabinet pick, he brought that person out to the press with him. Donald Trump has done things in a very different way. He's been very vocal throughout this process. And so just watching these two transfer power from one to the other, I think is really remarkable in this press conference. He was also very reflective in a way that I haven't seen him before on his impact on the Democratic Party. Yes, he's talked about, to Reid's point, about how he did all these things that Clinton didn't do and he got elected. But he also talked about how he has not been able to transfer his coalition onto Democrats. Right. And I think that's a really important acknowledgement. He kind of acknowledged that he has not been able to get other Democrats elected. That's pretty striking.
Reid, how about for you, the biggest takeaway from watching?
So my takeaway touches on something that you mentioned to Leslie a few minutes ago. We have become an almost overly politicized nation. Consider the fact that the president-elect of the United States of America is openly questioning the CIA and whether or not it is political. We've seen Republicans in Congress in the last 24 hours questioning the Federal Reserve and whether or not its decision to raise interest rates is a political decision. And in today's Washington Post, we've got the campaign chairman for Hillary Clinton openly questioning what's happening at the FBI. Far too many things that we used to agree on, that is that the CIA and the FBI and the Fed were apolitical agencies, are now becoming politicized. 4 years ago, the Republican presidential nominee said that Russia was our greatest geopolitical threat, and the poll that you discussed, a YouGov poll, and they've conducted a lot of polling with CBS, showed that Vladimir Putin's net favorable rating went from something like -60 among Republican voters to -10 among Republican voters after Donald Trump became the party's nominee until today. I don't think you can legitimately talk about those two as a separate issue. I mean, even the notion of a foreign enemy that Mitt Romney talked about 4 years ago has now become an overly politicized issue. That's what President Obama said. He said, let's take a step back and take a deep breath. Maybe we'd all be well advised to do that.
Yeah, think about think about our political dialogue. It needs to be stronger. And Leslie, finally from you, the biggest takeaway.
Biggest takeaway is the president. It was something that was moving around on Twitter. The president inherited an economic crisis, and he's leaving with a constitutional one. And it very much talk about timing and how things move in and out. And one thing that was interesting is when he talked about news and media, and you guys have been reporting on this, it was almost a page from the Trump playbook with respect to like the media and the role here. And the voters are really reinforcing existing biases, so that it was basically the point, it was getting harder and harder to get the truth out because people were just siloed, hyper-partisan, hyper-political, and it makes governance extremely difficult. That hasn't changed, it's just peaked. And that's the unfortunate part looking ahead.
It's the saying that I keep thinking about. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube once it is already out. Leslie Sanchez, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Reid Wilson, thank you very much for joining us.